Hello everyone, today we discuss the political and strategical circumstances revolving around the Peace of Vasvár, alternatively referred to as the Peace of Eisenberg, emerged as a pivotal treaty signed on August 10, 1664 between the Habsburg monarchy, led by Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, and the Ottoman Empire. Right, so we go back a bit in time compared to our more usual Siege of Vienna focus, in an era that was not less important because actually the events here, especially the Battle of Szent-Gotthard, were the ones that fundamentally allowed for the Viennese survival 20 years later, right? At the time of the Battle of Mogers, as you know, there are different names to call the Battle of Szent-Gotthard. Vienna did not have enough fortifications, right? The 20 years between Montecuccoli's victory over the Turks and, in fact, the siege of Vienna of 1683 were crucial to save the Habsburgic, what had become de facto already a proper capital. Vasvár is an Hungarian name. You have this, in fact, also for Szent-Gotthard, Mogersdorf, etc. There are different names for each one, reflecting the frontier nature, the overlapping, also ethnic hierarchies that existed here. Basically, the Germans ruled, and so most of the local names were essentially the German version, not even the Germanization of the same, as well as sort of pertaining also to a time in history where Hungary, that was split, as you know, between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans at this point, and through a different gradation also within, especially from the Ottoman side, had been importantly influenced by the Germans. Just for the sake of it, the other day I made a video about German-Hungarian warfare of 300 years before. If you think about this, like the heart of the Middle Ages were not even that far away from the events traded, and Central Europe, I dedicate very much this content to the broader Middle European world, especially the one lost after World War I, and in many ways, in fact, very much in need to be recovered in a proper European cultural unity. We already discussed the Treaty of the Peace of Vasvár, right? We started from there looking at sort of different Habsburgic policy. Now, this accord formally ended the brief yet fierce Austro-Turkish war spanning 1663-1664. The war had originated from the deep-rooted border frictions between the two powers, intensified by the Ottoman efforts to solidify dominance in Transylvania, more than, in that case, like probably like the Hungarian plains from the Habsburg side, and also provocative incursions, in fact, more from the other, by Croatian Ban Nikola Zrinjni into Ottoman-held territories, in fact, again, from the western side instead, right? We also dedicated some videos to that Croatian establishment kind of perspective, the Krajina, the sort of the general intersection of Hungarian, Croatian, Serbian, even affairs under the Habsburgs and the Ottomans at the same time, very fluid and brutal frontiers, we'll see better now. And Ottoman troops commanded by Grand Vizier Kuprulu Fazil Ahmed Pasha essentially had launched a major invasion into Habsburg-controlled Royal Hungary. There was also the more developed, the more populated as well, from the western side, seizing important strongholds such as Nove Zamki, also called Ujvar or Ajšek Uvar, while ravaging areas including Moravia, so up to probably the Bohemian crown land, until their momentum was broken, right? This incursions of the Ottomans is incredibly reminiscent still of the essentially Hungarian dimension of their provincial power base, that the forces that launched this attack, like we've seen recently, again, in the aforementioned video about Hungarian-German warfare, starting from Budapest, would essentially launch easily offensives into southeastern Bohemia, at least Moravia proper, and therefore creating some problem to the Habsburgs along the Danube, but along the Morava River. It was a word war, right? Brutal, but also relatively local. The turning point arrived with, instead, the major engagement that we just named, that is to say, the Battle of Szent-Gotthard, known also, in fact, more of Szent-Gotthard. Szent-Gotthard-Magersdorf fought on August the 1st, 1664, close to the modern Austro-Hungarian frontier beside the Rab River. In fact, it's known also, famously enough, as the Battle of the Rab, right? And this is one of the single most important battles in modern history. It's, again, very much like the one that allowed Vienna in 1683 to still be there to begin with. So that tells you how even smaller events can enable much bigger ones in, for example, in this case, from a tactical point of view compared to the much bigger effort of the siege of Vienna 20 years later. Last autumn, I made a video about Montecuccoli and Turenne. I also made a video about Montecuccoli years ago, explaining a bit like the caliber of this character, who was one of the most pluri-decorated commanders in modern history, was the Habsburgic Generalissimo. This was sort of almost a constant. This was an Italian-born subject of the empire that had distinguished himself during the 30 Years' War, and that would become not just one of the greatest commanders of the era, but also the cornerstone of military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. Right, and the generation of Prince Eugene, yet another, in that case, basically an Italian-French, that became the greatest commander, like in Habsburgic history, and allowed de facto for the Habsburgic Empire proper in the 18th century to take off in a sort of adequate territorial sort of military sense, was properly inspired by Montecuccoli. And there's all a chain of this, like from Montecuccoli to Prince Eugene, from Prince Eugene to Frederick II, from Frederick II to Napoleon. Then here we're mixing up to von Clausewitz, of course, command versus sort of military theory are two different things. But Montecuccoli's insights were incredibly appreciated also due to his curriculum. And the Battle of the Rab was his greatest accomplishment. Right here, essentially a coalition army under Habsburg leadership, directed by this accomplished Italian-born Austrian Field Marshal Raimondo Montecuccoli, as probably a massive strategist renowned for prioritizing also logistics, strict discipline, and adaptable maneuvers, successfully repelled a substantially larger Ottoman contingent. Right, there was nothing between this army and Vienna. Montecuccoli's accomplishments can be appreciated from the ones we just listed as sort of some hallmarks of his figure, exactly in this battle, because not just was a massive need of logistical built-up supplies, the Ottoman host was larger than the Christian one. There was also a coalition of essentially of German, Italian, French troops without some sort of broader sort of homogeneity in terms of cadres of collective training, that required, in fact, such an iron-fisted and cold-blooded ruler like Montecuccoli to manage, to inspire, etc., through strict discipline, but also actually showing, also not just for the Habsburgic side, in a sense, in a broader clash between the West and the Ottomans at this point, the increasingly effective firepower tactics that were, however, still largely dependent on combined arms once. And that, as such, like during this attempt at basically crushing the Ottoman breakthrough across the river, was incredibly masterfully, balancedly, and equilibristically handled in an also equally successful way by the Generalissimo of the House of Habsburg, the Holy Roman Empire proper. Allied support proved crucial here. So we enter a bit more like the international scene, because that's what we're also looking at today. International relations, diplomacy, which powers had been involved in all of this. as we've seen in the series about Vienna, French support would be minimal there 20 years later. At this point, because things had really changed, like we are already in the age of Louis XIV, but this idea of that, for example, just incarnated by Montecuccoli, like that warfare here, and not just in Central Europe, but chronologically speaking, is a confessional matters, that this is truly a crusade, like a fight against the infidels that are trying to take over one of the greatest centers of Christianity, the capital, de facto, at least in practical terms, of the Holy Roman Emperors and so on, was deeply felt aristocratically, internationally, as transconfessional, right? This happened also at Vienna. Many scions of some of even the most important Protestant families of Europe that were actively, at some point, even backing the Ottomans and their allies against the Habsburgs, could not but participate, right? Just out of sheer moral imperative and quest for glory, a lifestyle that really sparked this intense aura of knightly, chivalric, crusading valor, literally from the times of the medieval clashes already figured during the Ottomans at some point against the cross, and that had been living on very much lively at this point. And at Saint-Gotthard, particularly important had been, in fact, the French support, right? French units led by Jean de Coligny-Saligny. It would be, by the way, dramatically interesting to make some videos about these minor commanders that had sometimes such incredible rocambolesque military biographies, among other things, in this still largely feudal, medieval vibing Europe. The French, in this case, helped unsettle Ottoman leadership despite efforts to downplay the odds through exaggerated propaganda as well, right? They really committed themselves to an actual support of the Habsburgs, which historically had not been mostly French policy, right? But there was among the nobility and among those who looked at this Ottoman invasions as something very threatening, and still the most obvious threat to Christendom. The moral duty, right, felt to intervene. In the aftermath of this notable Christian triumph, imperial diplomat Simon Reiniger von Reiningen, a seasoned Styrian who had long represented Habsburgic interests as ambassador in Constantinople, and even traveled with the Grand Vizier during the invasion, negotiated the final terms, right? Consider the, again, still relatively, could say, homemade level of chivalric trust that was given even to the enemy. Like, this is an imperial ambassador, and he basically travels with the Ottoman army in the moment in which this invades the same Habsburgic territory. All right, and it was also good, like, of course, he would act as a spy of some sort, even though it's not like he would change too much. But it's really like how highly these figures were treated, even by the same opponents, what kind of, again, level of courtesy. In this, by the way, otherwise incredibly brutal warfare with people scorched and burned alive, children impaled. So this was completely normal on the Habsburg-Ottoman frontier. We should really come back on that. But still, like, how the sense of case, the sense of status mattered in all of this. And what is sort of bizarre in a way is that after the important Christian victory at the Battle of Saint-Gotthard, to say the least, the settlement between the two sides heavily ended up favoring the Ottomans, because it acknowledged their authority over Transylvania and the newly sized fortresses, which is strange because those were, as we've seen, from another side, probably taken by another Ottoman operation compared to the one that eventually brought to their own defeat at the Battle of Saint-Gotthard. And this is exactly the point. Like, even if, you know, that had been the case, normally when you sit at the table after this major victory, like, you know, you would ask the Ottomans to give back the fortresses. No, this did not happen. This pact actually included reciprocal quote-unquote gifts that amounted to tribute payments and established a 20-year armistice, which is essentially the prelude to the siege of Vienna, because naturally this was a truce in arms, all right? Reluctance, by the way, marked the signing on both sides, not like they were simply making favors to one another. Driven by competing concerns elsewhere, mostly, this is the point, it was an international situation that pressed this same local theater, yet the agreement delivered 2 decades of relative calm along the southeastern border, redirecting Ottoman energies towards other regions of their vast empire straddling 3 continents. This outcome carried immediate ripple effects westward across Europe, serving as a deliberate maneuver by Leopold I to adapt to evolving dynamics involving France and Spain, because these were essentially the most important powers for Habsburgic policy. Not just because the Habsburgs still reigned there, but because another branch of the Habsburgs, as you know, ruled in Spain, and France was the arch enemy of, in the sense, the Habsburgic house as a whole, of both branches. But also because of the limits of the Austrian Habsburgic power in Central Europe compared to these essentially mounting colonial powers and much sort of more structured militaries. By the way, I made some videos explaining how the Habsburgs of Austria were ideally sheltered. Like, we look at all these Ottoman threats, but at large, right? Also the reason why this very peculiar type of empire, institutionally, multiculturally speaking, existed, right, and managed to preserve to itself, aside from, of course, the traditional hierarchical nature of sort of the Central European powers, the fact that we're still talking the center of the Holy Roman Empire, the connections with the papacy, with Italy, the joint Ottoman efforts, and so on, was still somehow depending on this major outer powers, right? I made a video specifically on that is like the Habsburgs and, during the 16th to 17th century, and how they connected, especially with Spain at that point, talking the early part of the 17th century. Now, at the Viennese court and across the Holy Roman Empire, the era heavily shaped by Johann Ferdinand von Porcia, an Italian noble and refined count who acted as Leopold's principal advisor and Lord High Steward, promoting staunch anti-Spanish stances during the emperor's formative years, was drawing to a close. Right? In fact, Leopold felt profound unease at losing this capable and energetic ally, a figure that alone could make this sort of international stand. And a concern with this disappearance realized, especially when Porcia died in 1665, and therefore was really unreplaceable even just as an authority. To maintain administrative stability, the emperor thus swiftly moved to sidestep the top candidate for Porcia's role. It was the Count Franz Karl von Auersperg from the distinguished Austrian princely lineage, who later became the 3rd prince and served as imperial general as well. Right? All these figures, again, as noblemen, were mostly tasked with military duties. Again, here still the generalissimo is Montecuccoli, that will die shortly before actually the siege of Vienna. It will remain dominant in that role. But these figures, also in a political international sense, at the court also were also very influential. Now, beyond Auersperg's reputation for arrogance, whispers at the time highlighted his clear pro-Spanish leanings as a key deterrent. Leopold may have drawn inspiration from his cousin Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, who reigned, in fact, at this point from 1643 to 1715, who never named a successor after the death of his dominant minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Right? Louis was naturally a power concentrator, so to say, and he was probably just one of the very few rulers who could not just do so by character, but especially by scale, considering the magnitude of French power. And in fact, he would truly have his country stepping up as the newly tendentially continentally hegemonic power of the old continent. Leopold may, in this sense, have had a vision of sort of greater personal control on affairs. The sidestepping of Auersperg, however, could not make up for Leopold's more vulnerable character than, say, Louis XIV's, right? He was described as a sort of irresolute ruler. We've seen also at Vienna what happened hadn't it been for Father Daviano. Things would have really not been decisively managed at an international level. It's not like he was not an incapable ruler at all, but he was not the better one to have a more volitive approach to direct political control. At the same time, in fact, Prince Wenceslaus Václav Eusebius Lobkowicz, hailing from the venerable and powerful Bohemian family, one of the country's most ancient, he headed the Imperial War Council starting in 1652, and eventually rose to chief minister under the emperor, noted for his strong pro-French inclinations instead, gained prominence in Vienna at this point. His overt Francophile views were unmistakable, by the way, as was his barely concealed disdain for the Catholic clergy as a whole, right? He had, in this sense, a quite sort of anti-traditional attitude, especially in the wake of Habsburgic pious sort of papal alliances, champions of the faith as, in fact, Holy Roman emperors, and very much sort of fueling and being supported in turn by, in fact, a set of religious institutions, of clerical propaganda among the troops themselves, like probably to boost the Crusaders' morale against the Turks, etc. Even amid these internal imperial transitions, the Eastern Front remained the pressing priority, in fact, like for how powerful Louis XIV was and how much the French built up could endanger, as will happen in the following decades, the Rhineland, and so technically an imperial land that at some point also opened the gates to the French as far as its local Protestant rulers would have done anything, including subsidizing the Turks to damage the Habsburgs. The Ottoman threat was the closer, the most sort of unpredictable one in terms of the possibility of immediate military threat. Right, the French would have had to cross the entire Central Europe to reach Vienna, whereas the Ottomans could do this not even with less difficulties, but with much less international attrition, and also with a much bulkier military sustainability for the areas that would have had to sustain the same effort, and also vehiculated towards Vienna. As we have seen, the Vasvár Pact essentially enabled the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman one to codify their interactions for the next 2 decades, right? Despite mutual hesitation stemming from divergent urgencies, right? Habsburgic envoys in Vienna recognized that peace with the Porte would, at minimum, secure temporary tranquility in the Balkan-Danubian region. This was a quite diplomatic win that, though not loudly proclaimed, redirected Ottoman aggression to various Mediterranean theaters. So there were simply some ambassadors that were suggesting, okay, like we've already seen how the Ottomans behave. If we want just like some respite in the moment, we can't simply say, okay, let's freeze the situation. At the moment, okay, we will see, also we've seen it in other videos, how and where the Ottomans were involved. The the war will end for a while. 20 years is not a bad deal. More or less things would last. Now, this, however, from the other side, still emboldened the Sultan and his restless vassals to pursue offensives, in fact, still across Christian powers, including the Habsburgic allies. For example, the Venetian Aegean, the barbaric host that was in that sense not much in the hands of the Christians, but some North African powers were also in friendly terms with the northern shores of the Mediterranean. The Ottomans also attacked the Adriatic, the central eastern Mediterranean, the western Mediterranean shores at different times, and we are still in a time of piracy, or better, of corsairs and sort of different proxy powers that infest a bit like the wars of Mediterranean. It was completely normal. Christians were also pretty active. They themselves plundered the southern shores of the Mediterranean, and were also pretty good at it. You see here the cynicism. It would be very interesting, and unfortunately we can't do it. Perhaps like at some point we could even dig much deeper in primary sources, in Cartesians and so on, to see exactly, maybe even just like the personal words of these figures, and how they would conceive in a world that, at least we know how things went later, but at the time, these were the policymakers. They were the ones who were literally saying, okay, we are a respectable power, but we're not so big and proactive just because of scarcity of resources, of inner sort of institutional mechanisms as the Ottomans, as France. So we can just reason in terms of not even a generation of hopeful truce, just to at least stop pressure and so hope to regain enough resources to withstand the enemy's leg, which is exactly also what happened here. I mean, the Battle of Szent-Gotthard had definitely been already like a miracle, and as such, like some policymakers thought, well, it should have been treated also in terms of, okay, there is peace now, let's keep it that way. Now, the fresh stability between the two empires was affecting others here. Foremost, Louis XIV's administration. And so in this sense, the Sun King personally, as we've seen before. Also extending to Madrid, despite the long-standing quote-unquote family pact binding the two Habsburgic lines, a split dating back, as you know, over a century to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, 1519-1556, frequently compared in that sense as a much more grandiose figure than what the Habsburgs had basically turned into now. A modern Theodosius for his enormous realm divided between son Philip II of Spain and brother Ferdinand I. Well, as you know, the Austrian Habsburgs were the descendants of the latter, and in many sort of political and territorial ways, they had the worst deal, as a matter of fact. The French were looking at this temporary Austrian settlement as potentially annoying for them. The Spanish were more concerned with sort of broader global issues, but also the Mediterranean coastline, and again the Ottoman visits on the North African coast that still at that point were even influencing Spanish policy from within. The Moriscos revolts had historically been quite leveraged by the passage of Ottoman corsairs and so on. Now, this quite lingered even though Leopold had crafted the deal with Spanish sensitivities in mind. They weren't literally throwing each other under the bus, right? They realized that, of course, like by making a truce with the Ottomans, some Turkish resources would have been liberated against the other Habsburgs. There would have been also general concern for France, because normally the French and the Ottomans were allied. So in that sense, the same Turks were doing something similar towards the French allies, and it's not like the de facto alliance would come less in that regard. There were, again, enormous pressures at court, as we've seen with these intrigues, these factions, these figures around which you can imagine these ambassadors / spies, negotiators, etc., would gravitate. Think about them even just in personal terms, coming with their carriages, with their servants, with their supplies, resources, etc. Like it's a very interesting environment. Comparable worries afflicted the Republic of Venice, by the way, the Serenissima, with her still formidable maritime power, long in rivalry with the Ottomans. It's also evident that the papacy was not particularly happy in spite of the victory. Of course, there was still much to do against the Turks, and even Tuscany demanded to govern the Grand Duchy of Central Italy. Why? Because they all feared at this point escalating raids by North African corsairs along the Mediterranean coast. I made a video about the War of Morea, and so we've seen how the Maltese, the Tuscans, the Venetians would be deeply involved against the Ottomans, navally speaking, and how much, again, their maritime potential could be put profitably to use. Together, in fact, instead of more central European advance, a more Danubian advance from the Austrian side. Ottoman decision-making responded predictably to three major external threats in turn. Venice at sea, so one also the more involved, especially amid the still ongoing Cretan War, the famous War of Candia. That's something we absolutely must cover, never done it in all these videos. This was, as you know, the incredibly prolonged siege, 1645-1669 over Crete, as also Venice's final significant overseas holding, highlighting the brutality, the contrast between Constantinople and the Serenissima in this 21-year siege of Candia, ultimately culminating in Ottoman success, but at an irreplaceable cost. Right? It's basically at this point that Italy, from one side, ceases to be a superpower, because with Venice basically not being able to replace much of the Cretan possessions, and just out of the sheer expenses, like much would change in the Mediterranean, mostly also in the world, because the English and the Dutch were also raising as their fleets as the new dominators of the waves. In fact, the same Venetians had made a video specifically about this. The Armata Sottile and the Armata Grossa had started buying, in fact, properly oceanic vessels next to the galleys that were still quite functionally in use. On the other side, the Ottomans literally bled themselves white, right? The siege of Candia was a staggering process. Venetian defense was heroic to say the least, right? And the Turks had even to stop sort of distributing the alms to the widows, to the orphans. It is a duty in Islam and so on, in order to fund what would be a financial disaster, and also militarily speaking, essentially a Pyrrhic victory. Other involved powers in this were Poland, right? That, as you know, generally speaking, was the other possible target of Ottoman expeditions / invasions, right? Aside from the Ottoman slave raids in Ukraine, into Poland and in other surrounding areas, there was a viable choice in terms of which Christian capital to besiege that did not include just Vienna, but Warsaw. You would say, how? The Ottomans up to the lower Vistula? Yeah, right. It would have been, of course, like nightmarish in a logistical sense, but in a sense, don't think that Vienna was, in fact, that by scale different, right? It was closer, so it would be easier, but by scale, definitely the Ottoman military could in theory besiege even Warsaw. We'll talk more about Polish-Ottoman wars because I think they're very important. There was the same Tsarist power to the north that was at this point gaining ground further in Eastern Europe at the expense of different principalities and the same Poland, Lithuania. You have Persia to the east, that is sort of the not much maybe the alter ego in an Islamic sense of the Ottomans, also in a cultural sense, in a military one, also in a religious one as well, right? Sunni versus Shia, but mostly like the Ottomans stand out in that contest, like a bit like the more westernized power, really more firearms, more sort of drilled infantry, which is paradoxically what they lack in comparison with the Westerners proper, with Europeans. Even if many Ottomans were Europeans, all their sort of various auxiliaries of the vassal states, whereas Persia was still truly like a medieval country. They fought. They had, of course, their own firearms and everything, but they still fought as a, with their own knightly tradition. They were more about cavalry. It was a Middle Eastern, but also Central Asian bias. Here, I haven't had this at the beginning, but I have resumed the cycle. After, I think, months of absence, I re-extracted from our magic lottery the special topic that I had already prepared for many months, but I had not covered up to today. So this video is still part of that, right? So we will see at some point the same Persian army at work. We will see at this point also the various campaigns involving them against the Ottomans and so on. Then, as we were hinting at before, the Treaty of Vasvár was was influencing the Ottoman relations with the long-standing, though officially unadmitted, ally of France. This Franco-Ottoman alignment, the impius fidus, rooted in Francis I's era, right, between 1515 and 1547, through pragmatic anti-Habsburg ties with Suleiman the Magnificent in the 30s of that century, targeted Habsburg Spain and the empire at the same time, right? Talking still the Italian wars, especially in a moment in which the French had been after Pavia de facto sort of knocked out or from Italy. At least there would be other attempts at expeditions, but at that point, it would have been because, Charles VIII had started those wars with the idea in theory, or the claim, that he would have had to use Naples as a launch pad to recover the Holy Land, right? You would think it's a Renaissance modern era. What do French kings think about? In theory, recovering Jerusalem. So as long as they were in Italy, the French were projected against, also because of their massive crusading legacy, sainthood. Think about Louis IX and so on during the Crusades, etc., against the Ottomans. As they bail out of Italy, of course, the Turkish-French connection increases, because at that point, the Spanish, the Habsburgs in general, the empire, were stronger. They had managed to contain the French. And so there were some broader international mechanisms here that could not really change that much, right? They're not imperatives, they're not inflexible. In fact, they were changing all the time, as we've just seen here. But again, geopolitics does not exist, only politics does. And in fact, for this reason, neither the empire nor Venice consistently drew the right conclusions regarding, for example, the Polish Commonwealth, the Res Publica Polonorum, if you want to be Latinly poetic about it, the elective monarchy uniting Poland and Lithuania, the same Muscovite Tsar, or the Persian Shah. Meanwhile, French sway bore down on Tuscany. The Medici Grand Duchy, so the Central Italian Renaissance center famed for artistic sponsorship and shrewd diplomacy, as a bit of a tip of the balance since, again, the aforementioned even Italian wars, we just recently made some videos about the Medici, that owed nominal fealty to both Pope and Emperor because they were part of the Kingdom of Italy, as Holy Roman Imperial subjects. Now, Tuscan rulers exercised caution to avoid overly antagonizing a declining Spain, which still dominated Tyrrhenian sea lanes via the so-called Stato dei Presidi. This was essentially some coastal strongholds, the Presidi as themselves. They were just in this narrow part of southern Tuscany, but still quite strategically controlling Mediterranean traffic. It was properly another state, like it wasn't part of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, it was held by the Spanish. And so the Medici did not want issues with Spain. Ultimately, Tuscany's comparative peace and wealth rested on its military fragility. The special legal status of Livorno, a thriving free port fostered by the Medici for global commerce, and constant diplomatic maneuvering. Right, Tuscany had never been an explosion of military power since basically the 14th century, and as such, it had successfully preserved, in fact, sort of buffer function among more powerful Italian states and especially foreign rulers. By contrast, England was mired in internal troubles at this point, from the disputed restoration of Charles II, reinstated in 1660 post-Commonwealth amid persistent instability, to the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665-1667. We never really talked about those. Anglo-Dutch wars are very important, navally speaking, also in the political sense, leaving, in this sense, little capacity for a sort of British involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean. Even though, again, both English and Dutch ships routinely frequented the Mediterranean already. As Venice reluctantly accepted the handover of Candia to the Ottomans despite vocal opposition, the Cardinal Carafa, raised to cardinal in January 1664, ready to depart Vienna, where Leopold showed no interest in extending any crusade, so to favor a Venetian, settlement in Candia, right, with further Christian support against the Ottomans. Leopold I faced sharp criticism for, in this sense, appearing excessively conciliatory toward the Ottomans, especially during the siege of Candia. This seemed like a betrayal of the same Crusader ideals. The Habsburgs, however, should have simply sent at that point, they would have sent troops, but also money, and notoriously, Vienna was not particularly affluent. It relied, as we've seen also in the series about Vienna, on the massive papal provided finances, thanks to, in fact, the Roman international standing, and also at that point sort of greater international pressure and commitment from other sort of Catholic powers mostly. So everything was pretty dark, as always. The Venetians were dying, exterminating, again, the Ottomans on the outer side of the fortifications, but nobody seemed interested in settling the matter, right? It's something you can understand even today. Like, there is a major war going on, but nobody has sort of the immediate long-sightedness and guts and whatever, just risk for gamble, which is the sap of the second Trinity person in Clausewitzian theory. It's properly the one of military genius, as a matter of fact. And so everything remains the same. It's a pretty decadent situation. Again, we are in a pretty difficult moment in European history after all, right? We often attribute to rampant moments of growth this kind of, it's actually positive character, right? But we often forget that these were also some of the most tumultuous and bloody and distracted moments in European history as well. We sort of overblown, for example, the bloodbath of the 30 Years' War. It's not like it did not happen, but, the idea that all of Germany lost like 1/3 of its population has been a bit resized, and we sometimes look at these other wars as, okay, well, these were maybe approaching the age of reason or something like that, but they were incredibly brutal, but it's not like the ones of the Enlightenment, in fact, much less destructive. But for some reason, we have a more coherent and sort of, in fact, bright idea of them in historical reception, pop culture. Now, news reached Paris through the Musée Historique on October the 18th, sparking a wave of lackluster but fervently outraged poetic compositions that spread rapidly. The French were upset that the Turks were defining themselves and that the Habsburgs were gaining power. Influenced by immediate post-event narratives, numerous historians also criticized Leopold for rushing into the agreement, attributing it to exhaustion or caution. Right? Probably, from their perspective, was even just the right thing to do, or at least the one that in the moment opened to sort of even multiple options to make up for it in the medium run. At the end of the day, however, in hindsight, we also see this as ultimately leading to no compromise, but to the same seizure of Vienna. So not very rewarding at the end of the day. Now, within Hungarian memory, the Treaty of Vasvár endures as the shameful peace, literally, causing lasting harm to the emperor's reputation in Hungary. A balanced perspective is needed. Because one can't simply rely on the propaganda of the time that was very politically instrumental, and as I always say, propaganda is a neutral term. You can propagate even pretty correct information. But it's also something that, in fact, is correct on the basis of the various powers' interests, not in an absolutely objective sense. And so you must interpret it first and foremost. So the clash at Szent-Gotthard undoubtedly decimated the Sultan's elite forces. Right? It was a massive bloodbath. Basically, the Ottomans advanced multiple waves across the river Rab under Christian fire, cavalry charges, continuous combined armed muscular force of this incredible tenacious imperial force, plus allies led by the magnificent Montecuccolo and so on. The importance of the Battle of Szent-Gotthard, and now I think we could make a beautiful video on, lays also in the fact that a Christian force compelled a much larger Ottoman host to withdraw from this broader attempt of conquest of Vienna. It's how existentially threatening this Turkish expedition had been, right? I horrifyingly discovered that many people don't even, really care about scenarios like these. They have barely heard of Turin. I discovered with even ultra horror that some have neither even heard of Montecuccolo. How do you know modern warfare if you don't know about Montecuccolo, the Battle of the Rab? It's bad. Like, it was real bad right here. And there is naturally in the broader picture, I don't know, the inflated propaganda on numbers from the Christian side. But there is no doubt that this victory dramatically shattered Ottoman morale, right? That Vienna was saved at this point. And that, in fact, we don't even recognize the Battle of the Rab unless, you are, a bit more into the militaria and Central Europe, simply because, fortunately, the Ottomans were stopped. But the meaning at the time in particular was incredible, and still something that the Habsburgs essentially leveraged to stand in this fortified position, also internationally speaking, mostly pursuing their own goals after that. There are debates regarding the actual amount of casualties that the Ottomans suffered. Some say that they didn't reach even 1/10 of the overall force. This is debatable. The chief difficulties of the Turks involved logistics and supplies by campaigning so far north. However, overall, they were really beaten and they had to withdraw. And the Battle of the Rab is really mostly a tactical masterpiece from the Christian side, essentially preluding to what will be linear warfare in many ways. There was still sort of a center, heavy infantry, say, still needing to hold the line, but the tendency was increasingly based on firearms, quick cavalry counterattacks, and so on. It's volume of fire that starts really impressing the the Ottomans that had managed to cope with their inferiority in the field with their own combined armed tactical recipe up to that point. Right at this point, probably Western firepower starts obliterating more Turks in their traditional sort of assault infantry, like heavy light cavalry and also artillery to some extent, because, and the point is actually that the Westerners already had more firepower also in artillery capacity, in terms of just like the quality of the individual armies, right? If you, of course, compare what the Ottomans normally brought to these massive sieges that they had learned how to conduct since the 15th century across the Mediterranean to storm massive fortifications. They had monster cannons in impressive quantity to probably shatter enemy defenses. But those times were kind of over. Also, military technology largely developed. However, there's a very famous anecdote about the Battle of Arab, namely the fact that when Montecuccoli seized the Ottoman camp, he found a massive amount of gunpowder that was evaluated in his estimate, and if he said that, we know that it's 100% correct, some of the finest quality of that. Admittedly, however, in turn, you want to appreciate that after the 30 Years' War, of which, as we've seen, the same Montecuccoli was a veteran, the European powers had started selling way more arms and armor to the Turks, in as much as they had undergone a overproduction crisis. Thus, a lot, not just of material, but also sometimes of personnel advisors from the West, especially from France, has started flowing to the Ottoman Empire, right? When you look at the battle, you realize that the victorious Christian troops also had suffered severe losses, and not much for the Ottomans, but because of the usual, this was true also from the Turkish side, the poor hygiene of those times, all right? Illnesses killing more than muskets and white steel, right? Montecuccoli, interestingly enough, describes the Ottoman camps as actually being well equipped for sort of basic hygienic precautions, and he also lamented supply challenges from his side. So, as always, in all big engagements, when you look at the odds, they tend to balance one another. It's been estimated that roughly 2/5 of the imperial soldiers fell sick during the Arab campaign, with French contingents noting around 200 fresh cases per day. This is probably an epidemic. And these pressures naturally bred deep resentment among the troops, reigniting long-standing ethnic animosities via mutual blame and issues. This was true for both sides, because the Ottomans were naturally like a broader multicultural force. There were many Christians in the Ottoman host that, obviously carried all the ambiguity and the issues of the toxic relations with the empire. The Turks in general were also pretty unhappy to serve in this cold and humid frontier, right, and with such big logistical strains, etc. From the Christian side, in the West, you see how the French were coming to fight for the Habsburgs, but also not being necessarily subscribing to their political line, right? And so there was a competition. You find really lots of volunteers, by the way, people like a really very simple, humble background that simply decided to serve in that campaign and die because they truly believed in that sort of sturdy, quiet, in this sense, unsung, at least in contemporary times, pious lifestyle that going to fight and die in a crusade still in the second half of the 17th century was something very much worth it. Again, you find people from, here from basically all Central Europe, Northern Italy, or even more distant. I made a video about that was about the Battle of Pedro-Verdun, but we've seen how the Count Orselli, right, could come back to Lucca with with an Ottoman tug, right, that was preserved in the local cathedral. You have the same French, right? You have even Protestants that come fighting, unofficial, like as individual noblemen with their retinues, as younger sort of heirs, princes, while their fathers were ruling back in northern Germany, and against, paradoxically, paying to boost the Turks that were to at some point kill their children in those clashes. It's a very dark and weird period if you're not familiar with world context. The bottom line, however, and this is something that was worth well discussion before with the anecdote on Montecuccoli's Turkish gunpowder barrels was partially touched, that we have in general regarding the fact that the Ottomans would have always been decaying in comparison to the Christians historically. And this is partially true. From the normal vulgata is that from Suleiman the Magnificent, there would be a general decline of the Ottoman Empire, especially after the siege of Vienna. Things started spiraling down, like with Prince Eugene also scoring massive victories, retaking this enormous extent of Central Europe, invading the same Balkans at the detriment of the Ottomans, right? But the bigger picture, and also this is important for the siege of Vienna as well, that we describe as being like a formidable operation from the Turkish side, that Ottoman combat effectiveness persisted fundamentally, right? There was definitely something going on that also the Battle of Szent-Gotthard highlighted. In terms of a ever more qualitatively muscular West that was able to break even the reigns of the Turks, that definitely in a century from now would have been just existing as a power because Europeans did not want to go at war with one another to essentially destroy, like to share the spoils of the Ottoman Empire itself. So if you look at this from an Ottoman perspective, of course it was catastrophic, and of course there is that level of decline. But in strictly military terms, in the moment, right, without the ex post insight, of course, the sense is that the Ottomans were still a formidable military, and they would provide with an enormous threat to Central Europe for a substantial time to come. Their retreat after Szent-Gotthard unfolded rapidly and perhaps disorderly, but avoided total disintegration, for example, so that the army was not entirely annihilated. They maintained a foothold in the area and kept core military structures intact as well. Naturally, in order to win a battle, very specific qualities are needed, but very often this, without adequate supplies, can dry up any capacity for counterattack. This was the case of the pursuit proper that had to be hotly pressed, by the way, especially against the still fundamentally intact enemy that Montecuccoli at this point would and could not receive from Vienna. That already at that point had just averted a major disaster. Yes, was sort of breathing again, but did not immediately have all the resources needed to wage war in a big fashion, like, I don't know, will happen in a couple of generations with Prince again, right? Just 4 days after the battle, Monsieur de Coligny informed the Generalfeldmarschall Montecuccoli that Ottoman encampments lingered close by. The Grand Vizier's tent relocated by merely 500 paces. Supported by Tatar allies, Ottoman cavalry conducted damaging raids into nearby Hungarian districts, severing supply routes from Styria. There was, as you know, an Austrian-controlled duchy. I made multiple videos both about medieval Styria and the early modern one. Also Slovenia, and so the part of Inner Austria under Habsburg control back then. This shows you how still dangerous, and especially through these incredibly mobile raiding parties of these auxiliaries coming as far as Crimea or even further beyond towards Central Asia, the Ottoman forces were. Devastation struck the countryside from both Ottoman quote-unquote infidel raiders and imperial troops themselves, by the way, because as we just explained, the same Montecuccoli lacked resources at this point. So if he had to campaign and to exploit his great victory, he had also to find the means to press on the Ottomans. Acute shortages, logistics being, of course, the Habsburgs rather than Montecuccoli's specifically perpetual headache, pushed soldiers to loot Hungarian peasants that were considered by the Germans, in any case, as some sort of a needed population, and who resisted, however, vigorously with any available weapons. In fact, these were not passive serfs open to unchecked violence or forced labor, bâtonnables et couvrable à merci, as some French noblemen from that force would have suggested. They were hardy, resilient folk seasoned in fighting bears, wolves, and outlaws, equipped with regular and improvised arms alike. Actually, they were very often themselves brigands, for that matter. The Magyar steppe flavor had not really diminished over time, especially ever since the Ottomans had destroyed the kingdom, and at least in any meaningful political, cohesive sense, and reinjecting a lot of those nomads of the steppes that had nomadized, if you want, part of this frontier that was really made about of all these back and forths, continuous attacks, and so on. So the Hungarians were in many ways like a broken people at this point, but they still, like in terms of sort of encircling isolated imperial foraging parties and so on, like they were dangerous, and you would have not liked to find yourself in such a situation from the other side. In the Fürstenberg region's Tegrub zone, enraged peasants inflicted a true slaughter on imperial forces. In fact, Montecuccoli's daily warriors escalated over collapsing supplies, declining morale, and fraying discipline. There wasn't probably even an enemy to strike, because you would never know whether behind that swarm that you were fighting with your vanguard, there was probably a more consistent Ottoman force, or where all the sort of other possible parties were scattered in all this, harassing your same supply lines with a hostile population of Hungarians that you were sort of depriving of basic sustenance for themselves. And so this was a pretty dramatic situation. At that point, Montecuccoli, that was again the single most decorated general in the head probably of the imperial army, even doubted his ability to sustain order among his own troops. Right, he saw the tenuous backing from the empire's Kaiser, that were the imperial circles, territorial administrative units whose troops were often, in fact, unenthusiastic and eager to depart. These were the various chunks of the empire that paid for the Habsburgic military expeditions, and whose contingents, scarcely known for zeal in this context at least, insisted on immediate pull-out post-campaign. Right? Again, many of them still lived in a kind of a medieval mentality, more akin to militia than proper soldierly forces, also because they weren't really paid that much to stay, right? And the general lack of resources was systemically felt probably on discipline, on the general capacity to keep these troops well in order. You have the same problems from Coligny's but now exhausted, bitter, and demoralized French volunteers. They were more picked troops. And again, these incredibly cocky noblemen, famous for their bravados, very good fighters, very sort of hot-headed, but also quite good fighters, that, however, joined Hungarians in condemning imperial misconduct and treachery. There was also a reason for that, because these men were also aristocrats in general. They were going there more like a sport. I mean, this was one of the most interesting aspects of the war. Again, the French, the Germans, the Italians, they all behaved pretty well at the Battle of the Rab. They really showed that level of European cohesion and consistency that, in spite of all sort of political issues, confessional clashes, different international alignments, did work very well, right? However, there were probably different perspectives on this. the French were still living themselves in an ultra-aristocratic, knightly, chivalric reality, right? If you look, for example, at what they did, this bravado was exhibited in many circumstances, right? For example, the Venetians that crossed the Bosphorus under Turkish cannonades, all fully dressed in high uniform and, rolling their drums in face of the enemy. The French, famously enough, at Candia had landed on the island, and these were all similar, like aristocratic volunteers, completely massacred during a fanatically brave, but ultimately, in fact, unsuccessful assault against Ottoman counter-vallations. French volunteers represented a chivalric ideal. They had maintained this attitude, bold, exhilarated by fighting, invigorated by combat's promise. They were really medieval knights, right? They were also repelled by camp drudgery, monotony, regulations, and hardships. All right, they were very difficult to cope with. Right, their exploit had dazzled with unmatched courage and elevated honors of wide linger in these feverish, mosquito-ridden swamps amid thieving, coarse soldiers and foul-smelling locals. Like, it's really senseless. That's not what you do. This was yet another sort of cross and another checked box on their military curriculum. They could go back to France and at court and in other circumstances they could brag in front of the dames about all these deeds. And it's amazing how even with the reduced means of communication of the time, these events could be verified, if anything, in a clientelary sort of social sense. Like other knights would sort of witness to this, like it would be voices running, etc. So it was all, like, especially the French mentality is forever intricately entwined with this enormous feudal establishment with, like, a hydra has sort of infinite heads. It's not like, I don't know, a Polish who sort of wouldn't sort of think in the same ways, but there was something even more historically primitive and smaller in scale. And so when these guys sort of had to remain there in this world war after the main chevrons earned after the Battle of Szent-Gotthard, it was the clue of the campaign. Of course, they would start missing France, all the various sort of commodities of their aristocratic life, and they wanted home. The Hungarian magnates, by the way, were, as always, displaying mountain disloyalty, presaging future plots and uprisings, because that's also what always happening here across Hungary, Croatia, with different allegiances to the most of the problem were to the Habsburgs. Most of the problem were the Hungarians, as always. All right, the Croatians were sort of much more faithful in general, but even there, the political balance was always sort of about sides changing in every possible circumstance. These magnates lived in a wild frontier. They could mobilize. They were very often colluded with the same Ottomans. It was they were Calvinists, right? We talked at length about what 17th century Hungary was at that point. So there is definitely an enormous amount of issues that do not make this imperial pursuit of the Ottoman army sustainable. After the death of the Palatine Ferenc Wesselényi, the premier noble rank, by the way, in Habsburg Hungary, Royal Hungary swiftly declined, paving the way also for the 70s revolt in the 17th century by Hungarian and Croatian nobles. The Magnate conspiracy and Wesselényi movement opposing Habsburgic authority were basically one with this as well, so you really couldn't trust anyone. And a reliable observer confirmed that the Ottoman soldiers, through weary and disheartened, were far from, again, broken or on the run. Simon Reinigen von Reiningen, that we mentioned before, was one of these sources, right? He was this Styrian imperial resident in Constantinople, and having trailed, as we were saying before, with the Grand Vizier throughout the Hungarian campaign against the same Holy Roman Empire, had really an invaluable insight diplomatically and just informatively for the same emperor, right? He himself, on August 10th, personally endorsed the Vasvár document alongside Grand Vizier Köprülü. That was, by the way, from one of the most Christian-hating families in the entire Ottoman Empire. It's fascinating that they drafted this together, because obviously at that point the imperial ambassador was mediating. And again, nobility was very much respected across the board. Certain scholars suggest that Louis XIV momentarily entertained using Hungarian discontent to seize the crown for himself. This obviously would have been just more like a symbolic thing to trigger the Habsburgs. Naturally, there were lots of noble complaints. The Hungarians would have liked to have such a big protector, especially the aforementioned Zrínyi, a Croatian-Hungarian noble, poet, commander, who battled the Ottomans also very heroically, but perished in a November 1664 hunting mishap. Had been part of this sort of Magyar voice, in the sense also against the Habsburg at the same time, and trying to have contacts in the with France. And I actually made a video about that as well, so if you're interested in him, we can even talk about it in other videos. Zrinski's sudden death halted any such schemes anyway, due to his authority. Lingering grievances ripened into the harsh rebellion in the 70s that, in any case, shows how continuous the political interest in such international connections really was. So, even within months, in hindsight, affirmed Leopold's wisdom in locking in this 20-year truce. Right, the confirmation came from the same Spain, where Philip IV's condition worsened rapidly. He was king of Spain from 1621 until his death on July the 17th, 1665. This triggered an impending succession crisis, by the way. For the moment, the amicable link between Emperor Leopold and the Sun King, bolstered by familiar connections, crusading imagery, and Szent-Gotthard prestige, remained solid. Right, by facade, it was accepted, because after all, you couldn't simply be at war with one another all the time. It's just a matter of which power would gain not much of the upper hand in one another, because they were distant, and especially the Habsburgic one, sort of obviously less than the French one. But still, let's say you had to use this in a completely fluid fashion every time something new came around, right? And so this friendly facade would turn out to be short-lived. In 1666, Pope Alexander VII, reigned from 1655, died. This had been one of the most zealous anti-Ottoman popes ever. There is a short pontificate of Clement X Altieri, 1670-1676, that kept Vatican pressure for anti-Turkish campaigns alive in the following years, yet supportive conditions were lacking in general. This again was not really a particularly good moment in European history. It would be lots of upheavals. I also made a video about, in fact, the French invasion of the Netherlands in 1672 that tells how big this whole issue practically was. I talked again about Montecuccoli and Turenne's campaigns on the Rhine. So you have all an interesting now sequence of videos about the 17th century that I managed to sort of encrust together for your views. Leopold henceforth prioritized the Ottoman-imposed balance in the Balkan-Danubian sphere. Right, Venice conceded Candia, its crucial eastern Mediterranean bastion. Great Christian defeat, but also again one that came basically at a huge structural cost for the entire Ottoman Empire. Right, they hardly could sustain this. It was a massive bloodbath. It was fundamentally sort of worth it in the moment to try, but not to continue that. At least once they had gotten in, they had to continue. And in any case, things would go badly for the empire in the following generations. But it was also a relative precondition for the Vienna siege campaign of 1683. The banner of crusade stayed lowered as a consequence of the fall of Crete, waiting for a fresh wind or a daring champion to unfurl it once more across Christendom. I also made a video about the crusading purposes after the Treaty of Westphalen. So if you want to go back like a generation before, you can see how this whole thing had produced itself. The same from the video about the Moravian War that I made last year. The Pope diligently sought a figurehead to initiate a holy enterprise that appeared both vital and unattainable. In Constantinople, buoyed by diplomatic successes at Vasvár and on the verge of fully seizing Candia, Ottoman authorities perceived benefits in adopting a more accommodating posture towards Leopold. All right. After all, yes, they had been beaten. This had been an humiliation and important loss of resources, but territorially speaking, not much had really changed. Actually, some strongholds had even been kept on the Habsburgic frontier, so now it was very convenient to freeze the same. Exchanges, by the way, grew more consistent in structure thereafter. For example, in 1665, the plenipotentiary Kara Mehmed Pasha reached Vienna with grand ceremony, warmly welcomed by intrigued locals, by the way. There are these descriptions of how these Ottomans showed up. 1 century later, you would have a Mozart that could sort of chant the Ottomans in very stereotypically also emasculated ways to an extent. But the same Austria had been really trembling because of this attack, and the Turk had remained, like, it had always been like a source of great terror, but also of great interest, right? The German princes, Schatzkammer, are full, as you know, if you have traveled Central Europe, with an enormous amount of not even just like Ottoman conquered trophies, but properly European-made Ottoman weaponry, right? That were the most sought after among these aristocrats. And so here shows you also the compromises that the Habsburgs were willing to accept in order to maintain the status quo, right? Kara Mehmed Pasha settled in Leopoldstadt. This was, as you know, a Vienna district honoring the same Emperor Leopold I, that at the time was literally like another town. And today is incorporated into the Viennese metropolitan area. And according to his own account, the one of Mehmed Pasha, his entourage included the renowned Ottoman voyager and historian Elia Çelebi, that is the celebrated explorer whose Sayyad name offers priceless eyewitness insights as well. And so you had there all an exchange of cultural insights between powers that actually knew well each other, but were sort of the paradoxically more conservative, even among enemies. I mean, like if you think about France, Spain, etc., like their global possessions, even mounting England and the Dutch, like so in this Western European world, in Central Europe, in the Balkans, well, of course, everything is much more enchanted in this older vision. And paradoxically, you even have this greater, more, again, homemade scale of relations almost that may seem strange considering how eventually these powers would end up, sort of, especially the Habsburgs, destroying the Ottomans repeatedly, reducing them to very poor thing compared to this point in a few generations. But in this sense, in fact, showing you how different and how, again, of another kind the Central Europe really was. And I'm really enjoying making these videos because I don't know how many people watch them, right? I can't make those videos about the cognitive bias of the Byzantine fanboys and so on that, tend to alterate things just like, but people watch the drama and whatever. But these videos are really the sap of what we need for a better understanding of European history and culture. And people often don't understand that if you miss these elements, you can't really go that far, right? You can't really admire and appreciate our history the way it really deserves, right? It's important to look at the big picture, but it's also important to look at the details, right? Because otherwise you would never notice how valuable even the bigger picture really is and how much you can derive from this, right? So on Schwerpunkt, I've always been satisfied by this exercise, and that's why we're going to continue on this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.